Welcome to today's webinar titled Exploring Executive Dysfunction in Pediatric Traumatic Brain Injury, presented by Dr. Hilary Murphy. My name is Laura Jacobs, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Brain Injury Alliance of New Jersey. The Brain Injury Alliance of New Jersey is a nonprofit organization with a mission to provide education, awareness, and support for those who have been affected by brain injury. On today's topic, we have many publications and resources that can be found on our website, bianj.org. Then click on Education, and then click on Publications and Resources. Today's webinar, Exploring Executive Dysfunction in Pediatric Traumatic Brain Injury, is being presented by Dr. Hilary Murphy. Dr. Murphy is a licensed clinical psychologist and trained pediatric neuropsychologist with a specialization in the assessment of neurodevelopmental and neuromedical disorders. In addition, she is a New Jersey certified school psychologist, and her training provides her with expertise in collaborating with educators and families to develop comprehensive educational and treatment programs. So, with no further ado, Dr. Hilary Murphy.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad to be able to be with you today and to talk about a topic that I'm immensely interested in and I think is incredibly important to parents, to families, to school officials, and to anyone who works with children or adolescents. Now, what I typically will hear when anyone asks me about this topic is they want to know why this is so important. And as someone who has had experience working both in the schools as well as in private and public community clinics, what I can tell you is that this is something that's very, very common. And what I want to talk about is what are some of the outcomes for the individuals that we can see who present with these incoming concerns with something like traumatic brain injury. We know that it's a very common cause of injury and disability in children and adolescents, and understanding and being able to educate parents and family members and any other caregivers or individuals involved in either the education or care of any of these individuals, I think is incredibly important. It's something that we should be talking about and is an ongoing conversation because there's always new literature, there's a lot of new information that's coming out, and there are some myths that I think are very much worth dispelling as we move forward. Now, one of the other questions that I typically will get is why do I want to focus on executive functioning rather than some of the other areas of neurocognitive functioning, including general IQ and language skills? And I also really like to kind of broach why that is so important, particularly in this population, and why it's something that we see as tied to later adaptive functioning and just general outcomes, which we'll explore as the talk goes on. Now, just as a quick review, any kind of definition for a traumatic brain injury typically involves either an acquired injury from an external force or what we call an acceleration-deceleration injury. Think something almost like whiplash or in a car accident where your head is thrown forward and back. What can happen is that in that action, many times our brains are then jostled a bit, and it's that act of jostling that can produce certain kinds of injuries that can be incredibly impairing to many individuals. Now, we classify these types of injuries as mild, moderate, or severe. And I want to emphasize that for the purposes of this talk, we are going to be focusing on individuals who would be classified as either moderately or severely injured, because we know that mild traumatic brain injury, which is also referred to as concussion, has a very different recovery trajectory, different circumstances that we have to talk about. Those are sort of a separate category in and of themselves. So anytime that I'm using the phrase traumatic brain injury or TBI, I just want to emphasize that's the population that I'm talking about. And these are the kind of characteristics that we're going to be going over later through this talk. Now, what we know is that for anyone, either child or adult, with a moderate to severe injury, typically we see the greatest gains in any kind of cognitive or physical functioning, any kind of recovery within the first 12 months. Now, it's very important to point out that this doesn't mean that after 12 months that there is no growth whatsoever. But it means that we see the fastest growth, and it's why it's so important to intervene in this early period to make sure that people are making the most appropriate gains. And we also know that after that period of time, other features, not things related to the injury, but things like social support, access to appropriate resources, these are the circumstances that have a much greater impact on an individual's recovery rather than just the injury itself. And it's why, as we talk about some of these other factors, we're going to focus on the availability of social support and the kind of cognitive resources that we can offer to families, because we know that at a certain point, that's where we transition our focus to. Now, executive functions are a really unique little skill set. We used to think that these were things that just came online sort of towards the end of an individual's life. What we see typically is these are associated with activity in what we call the prefrontal cortex, so the foremost area of our brain. What we know is that this is a really unique skill set, and it's something that can be affected by any kind of injury towards any area of the brain. Even though we associate it with the most forefront area, it's not just circumscribed to that part. Now, what does that mean? Essentially, what I want to say is that any injury, anywhere, one of the first things that we're going to see is a disruption in these functions, simply because they're so vulnerable. And our brain works more like an orchestra. All of the players together have a role. If any one player, any one musician is taken out, the song is going to be different. That's what I want to emphasize here. We also know that any kind of traumatic brain injury, the frontal areas tend to be particularly vulnerable because of the nature of the injury itself. What we know is that there are two different kinds of injuries we can see. And getting too deep into the weeds, essentially we can see shearing injuries. So that's where the cells within our brain, they get torn a little bit, and it's harder for them to communicate. We can also see contusions where the brain strikes something and it just essentially does not work as effectively as we would want it to. Essentially, what we want to emphasize here is that certain aspects of the injury itself can result in some of these executive functions being particularly vulnerable to some of these effects. Now, as we move on a little bit further, we know that cognitive functioning more generally, even in moderate to severe traumatic brain injury in pediatric populations, they show a lot of recovery, which is wonderful. We tend to see that general intellectual skills, things like our speed of processing and problem solving, our general attention, our memory, and a lot of our visual perceptual skills recover to a certain point over time. Now, there's a lot of individual variability here, but essentially what we want to emphasize is that in many domains we can see that there are going to be a lot of gains. What we see long term is that many of these individuals struggle to gain access to or become proficient in a lot of these key executive skills. And that's why we tend to focus on these the most when we're trying to look at anything else in terms of recovery. Now, when I talk about executive skills, a lot of times I refer to a particular theory. There's many, many, many out there. If you look at anything in psychology, we like a lot of theories and we like a lot of acronyms. It's some of our favorite things to put out there. I like to think of what's called the executive control system. And it breaks a lot of these skills down into one of 4 categories. And I think that this is a really nice way to better explain it to parents. And also, it comes out of the neurodevelopmental literature, meaning that this is looking at individuals as they age, as they develop all of these skills. And so it was developed with children in mind. So this is really what I like to think of when I'm trying to explain these abilities. Now, executive functioning is a phrase that we throw around a lot, particularly in education. And really what it is, it's an umbrella term. And all it refers to are all of these skills that we need to be successful adults. These are the things that allow us to establish realistic goals for ourselves and then put ourselves on a trajectory to achieve those goals. So things like being able to regulate our attention, being able to stop ourselves from acting on impulse, planning skills or organization abilities, the fluency or the speed at which we are able to take information in and respond to it appropriately, as well as our ability to use feedback. And we're going to get a little bit more in depth into what exactly this looks like for children and when we would expect some of our children to demonstrate some of these abilities. But I always like to, harken back to some of our theory and everything to try to explain how we understand a lot of these more complex, higher order skills. This is another way that I like to think about it, is that, again, like I mentioned the analogy of the orchestra. All of these skills work together. They're separate but intertwined. And what we know is that they tend to develop one after the other, and they influence each other. So it's not like separate little compartments. It's something more cyclical than that. And that's why when we see one being impacted, we tend to see a couple more all hang together. They usually develop together, and they can be impaired together. Now, I like to always talk about attention because attention is something that I think we have a really limited view of more generally. When you think of just someone who can pay attention, you think for long periods of time, but it's a little bit more complex than that. And what we essentially know is that there are a couple different aspects of attention that we as neuropsychologists try to look at and better understand. So we have something like just basic attention span. If you think of your brain like a mental sketch pad, when we had to remember phone numbers before we had cell phones that did everything for us, your attention span would be the thing that allows you to keep something like a brief phone number in mind, just there. If you don't rehearse it or repeat it or drill it, you lose it. So maybe if you didn't keep repeating that phone number to yourself, you might forget it after you dialed it. It's just meant to hold a little bit of information just to help us do one quick task. Focused attention, that's essentially where we're going to really make sure that we pay attention to one specific aspect of our environment. Think about if you're sitting in a college classroom and you're paying attention to the lecturer. That's focused or regulated attention. Now, when we know that anytime that we're paying attention, we're not in a vacuum. We're usually not alone in that college classroom is what I mean. So we not only have to focus, but we have to filter out anything that we shouldn't pay attention to, like that person behind us that keeps clicking their pen even though we've asked them a few times not to. So we know that attention, again, is a little bit more nuanced than just focusing on one person. It's also regulating, okay, I don't have to pay attention to that person behind me. I don't have to look out the window because that's not where my attention should go. And when we think about being able to shift between tasks, a lot of times my students, when I'm teaching this aspect, will say to me, well, does that mean multitasking? I thought we weren't supposed to promote that. It's not multitasking. It's more being able to shift seamlessly between one act and another. The best example is taking notes. So again, you're back in that college classroom. You're looking at the board. You're listening to the lecturer, and you're looking down to take your own notes. You're doing things in almost simultaneous fashion, but really you're not multitasking. You're doing one, then switching to another, then switching back. Now, looking just at these types of attention, it's easy to see how any child with even a slight impairment here would really struggle in a lot of different areas. Paying attention in a noisy classroom, or even listening to someone when they're talking in something like a restaurant. Again, a lot of times what we'll see is that people who have deficits in this area, they don't just struggle to pay attention, they might be having difficulty filtering other things out. And that can be a cause of a lot of stress for many of the families that we work with. So let's talk a little bit more about some of these other aspects of executive functioning. We've reviewed attention regulation. And the only other thing that I'd like to highlight, and it's something that I think is very important, is that attention is always dependent on our level of interest and motivation. I like to always give the example that if you sat me in a classroom that was talking about perhaps neuropsychology, something that I really like and I love to learn about, I'm probably going to pay attention a lot easier than you put me in a calculus classroom because frankly, I wouldn't understand what anyone was saying, and I'm pretty sure that I would fall a little bit asleep. Same thing for any child. We learn to pay attention to the things that we might not be immediately interested in over time. But if we're really, really disengaged, maybe it's because we don't think we're good at something, or we just aren't interested in it, or it's at a bad time in the day when we're very, very tired, or we're hungry, or there's something else that's taking precedence, we're already going to be a little bit behind the 8 ball. If you mix that in with someone who already has attentional issues to begin with, we really see a lot of difficulties, both at home and in school, and even in extracurriculars. I have a lot of parents who will talk to me about how their child will be able to sit and play video games for hours upon hours upon hours, but when they go to gymnastics or soccer or karate, consistently paying attention to the instructor is very difficult. And usually what I have to explain is that, well, yeah, video games are made to be incredibly enticing and stimulating, and it's a little easier when we're in a large environment with other kids who might also all be talking to listen to the one instructor who's telling us what to do. Now let's talk about inhibition. We all know that there are times that we act on impulse, and inhibition is essentially the ability to put brakes on our urges. So any child who has a difficulty in this area, these are kids that we refer to as being very impulsive. I always like to make the differentiation that we can see people being physically impulsive, the kids who are out of their seat a lot, they're jumping around, they're fidgeting, playing with things. They can be verbally impulsive, the kids that blurt out answers or interrupt conversation. Or we can see some aspects of emotional impulsivity. I think of them as the knee-jerk reactions to something that really upsets or bothers a child. You know, again, we all learn how to stop ourselves when we become very angry or upset or frustrated with somebody else. We learn these cognitive controls. But for children who struggle in this area because of an acquired brain injury, it's much harder to do that just at baseline. They'll act on impulse, and oftentimes I see the cycle of an impulsive action followed by immediate regret. Not because the child wants to be disruptive or mean or any other kind of reasoning. It's simply because it's harder to stop themselves. And that emotional impulsivity is something that a lot of people forget is tied to some of these executive functions. Now, set shifting is a little bit harder to describe. Being mentally flexible is essentially our ability not just to think of different ways to solve everyday problems. You know, if, for example, we want to do something a little differently because today we have a substitute teacher, or today we can't take the same route to work that we always do. Well, we find a detour. We find an alternate route. Children who struggle in this area can often seem to be very rigid. They'll insist on doing the same thing the same way, even if it's not helpful, even if it acts against them. And this is important because a lot of times this is misinterpreted as a child being purposefully stubborn or even defiant. And in some instances, it can be tied to anxiety. Children who tend to struggle with being flexible often want to do the same thing over and over because it's predictable. And if you tie in the fact that a child may have some anxiety after suffering an injury that may have been traumatic just in and of itself because of the circumstances, say a car accident or a bad fall, this can be an expression of their anxiety related to that event. Or it could be the byproduct of the injury itself. Now, also what we see is that it's part of the ability to solve problems in new ways. The best way I typically can explain this is in social circumstances. We all know that as we get older, our relationships with our friends, eventually our family and our intimate partners, it becomes more complex because there's more things that are on the table, more things that we're dealing with. And for children who struggle with this mental flexibility, knowing how to use feedback in their environment, kind of reading the room, reading the expressions of other people, and being able to shift and do things a little bit differently is going to be a little bit harder. And we'll talk about this more as we get to the mood and social aspects of these outcomes a little bit later on in this talk. Now, initiation, this is probably one of the most common ones that come into my office very typically. It's, yes, My child is the kind of kid that you need to say it. Timmy, can you start your homework? 5 minutes later. Timmy, I want you to get started on your homework. 10 minutes later. Finally, the parent is to the point of getting really frustrated and upset and is like, why can't you just get started? And again, this is another behavior that can often be misinterpreted as a child being purposefully disruptive or defiant or oppositional. This is a kid who will procrastinate to the ends of the earth. And oftentimes, this is a really complex behavior, something that, again, can be tied to anxiety. We tend to avoid the things that we're most nervous about. You know, I remember when I was still in graduate school, my one professor would say, you know, when you're writing your dissertation, you never realize how dirty the grout is in your bathroom because you'll do anything to avoid having to sit down and write that long, 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 long paper. And it's true because it makes you nervous to have to sit down and write it. And it's not exactly the most interesting thing that you want to do all day. And so you'll find almost any reason to avoid it or put it off or say, oh, I'll do it tomorrow. Tomorrow will be perfect. Well, same thing for a lot of kids, even with just general mundane household tasks. This is why kids can often need a lot of reminders to get started on something. It's also because sometimes kids don't know exactly where to start. I like to use the example of a book report or an essay. A child might have a month to do it, but it can seem overwhelming. You know, where do I start? Do I start, you know, by choosing the book, and then after that, what do I do? So a lot of times being able to sit down and say, well, maybe we read 10 pages tonight and 10 pages tomorrow, and we write some notes, or we, you know, generate some ideas of what do you want your paper to be about. Breaking things down in a way that makes sense can really help in this domain. And in addition, we know that it's really easy to become distracted, and that can also add to some of this procrastination. Now, performance and behavior monitoring are two sides of the same coin. Essentially, how well and how aware are you of how your behavior impacts those around you? So I use the example of reading the room, seeing how your tone of voice, your behavior, your facial expressions are influencing either other peers in the classroom, influencing your parents as you're talking to them, being able to know when somebody might not be interested in a conversation topic or might not want to talk to you or might be trying to enter in or say something. And on the other side, we have performance monitoring, and this is essentially a child's ability to edit their own work, being able to look back and find little mistakes or knowing, oh, I rushed through that a little bit. I should probably make sure that I checked everything so I know that I do a good job on that test or on that assignment. Again, two sides of the same coin. And finally, but not, you know, ultimately, we have working memory. This is a really complicated little skill. And it's complicated because there's a couple different aspects to it. And it's something that is tied to a lot of outcomes later on. Essentially, working memory is part of that mental sketchbook I mentioned before, where you would jot down, you know, in your brain a phone number before you had to dial it. Essentially, it's our ability to hold on to little bits of information to perform an immediate task. But it's also related to our ability to manipulate that information. So say instead of remembering a phone number, you had to do a quick mental math calculation to know if you had enough money to buy groceries that day. You know, or if you have to keep a multi-step direction in mind. That's all working memory. And what we know is that in addition to all of these things, there are certain skills that are related to academic outcomes, most notably what we think of as the phonological loop, our ability to hold on to auditory information. We have the visual spatial sketchpad, which is something that's related to mental math, like I mentioned before, and what we call the central executive, which is, I always think of it as a little guy at a desk who's directing our brain and telling us what to pay attention to, how to do it, and what to do. And we're going to talk about the phonological loop and the visual spatial sketchpad a little bit later on when we get to the academic part of this discussion. Now, one of the things that I also like to talk about here are some of the misconceptions about pediatric traumatic brain injury. You know, what it used to be thought of is that the earlier that you were injured, the more likely that you would have better outcomes, because essentially you had so much plasticity in your brain was able to compensate for any injury or weaknesses, that the younger you are, the better, for very, lack of a better term and very basic. But what we know is that that's not always the case. And that for many individuals, even though we see a lot of these gains in terms of the IQ, in terms of the basic attention, the things that I had mentioned before, one of the things that tends to be impacted long-term are these executive skills. And the reason that they're not immediately apparent is because for many children, those skills are still developing. So they have a pattern that's commonly referred to as delayed consequences. They essentially grow into the deficit. So for example, if you sustained a traumatic brain injury at 6 years old, when you're 9, 10, or 11, when we expect more from you in terms of your ability to plan, keep assignment details in mind, make sure that you pack your backpack every night, all of those little things that start to create the foundation for what we think of as our executive skills as adults, we start to see difficulties, not because you've lost skills, but because now it's more apparent because we expect more than we did when you were initially injured at 6. So again, a lot of times people will have the misconception that the child has lost an ability, and that's not really the case. Really what we're seeing is that an individual has a lot of difficulty because now we expect more and more and more from them, and with those increasing demands, they start to struggle. Now, when we think about the development of these key skills, what we know is that there's a lot of periods of rapid growth that occur initially in preschool and then later on in late elementary and middle school. I like to think of these as little growth spurts in terms of our cognitive functioning. So what we see is that the very rudimentary foundational skills that are related to executive functioning, so just the ability to orient our attention, look at something in our environment, those start to manifest in the first year of life. Imagine a little baby like the one in the picture looking up at a mobile and starting to focus on the toys hanging down from it. That ability to focus and look at something, just exclusively focus on that in our environment, that is a building block for attention regulation. So given the fact that we see them so early, what we know is that any disruption from something like a traumatic brain injury can interfere with our development of these skills later on. Now, what we know is that the general rule of thumb is that we typically see children as young as infants, like I mentioned, showing a lot of activity in these the prefrontal cortex, so that foremost area of our brain that I talked about before. We tend to see attention regulation starting to emerge first. Then we see cognitive flexibility, so being able to think in a little bit of a different way, starting to come on a little after that. And then we start seeing things like our working memory and our processing speed, our ability to set goals, starting to come online between 10 to 15 years of age. So again, it used to be that we would always think, okay, it's really not fully developed until we hit adulthood, but what we see is that these skills are developing slowly as we go. And what's interesting is that as we talk to parents, we've seen that within the past few years, the demands on these skills in academics has increased considerably. Kids at earlier and earlier ages are expected to become more independent in their learning, essentially just to remember when they have to do certain things, remembering when they have to turn in a certain assignments. And with that, any child who has even slight difficulties there are starting to come to attention earlier and earlier. Now, when we think about the trajectory again, what we see is that the earlier maturing skills tend to have the best improvements over time. And what's hypothesized is that a skill that's already developed by the time that the injury occurs is more likely to be regained over time. But the ones that haven't fully been developed yet, the ones that were still starting to emerge, those tend to be far more vulnerable to a lot of these early injuries. So essentially, if you've got it by the time that you're injured, you're more likely to get it back as you make your recovery. But if you hadn't developed it fully, it might be something that continues to represent weakness for you as you get older. And again, when we think about what this would look like in a child as they get older, we can see limited planning skills. So a child who doesn't know how to break things down, doesn't know how to plan for that book report that I talked about before. Difficulties inhibiting their impulses. They might be very impulsive in their conversation or behavior. They might struggle to set goals. This is another big one, especially for children who are in middle school and high school who are now starting to think about what do they want to do as they move forward in their lives. Limited self-regulation, and that's something that can inhibit, our interpersonal skills, because it can be really difficult to stop ourselves when we become really upset or frustrated, and being able to express that in an appropriate way. Disorganized kids, children who struggle to have feedback to guide their behavior. Again, all of these key skills that really become very, very important for us to be successful socially and academically. Now, I always like to have this table here just to give clearer examples on what some of these skills will apply to in a child's day-to-day life, because a lot of times when we're talking about them, they seem very abstract, but they're very, very practical for us. And this also gives me a nice example to talk to families about. So I might not say, how is your child's planning skills? I might say, do you find that your son or daughter has trouble planning for assignments that have more than one step? Again, I usually like to think of that book report assignment. Do you find that your child's desk or workspace at home and in school is disorganized? How often do they forget their personal belongings, like cell phones or glasses, or sports gear is a very popular one? How is their time management skills? So how long does it take them to get ready every morning? Are they the child that's chronically late for the bus, or is fashionably late for any kind of social functioning? And again, this just provides families a nice background to really try to say, okay, yeah, that is something that I notice is really hard. It gives a more tangible, practical example about what we're talking about here. Now, when we move into the social adjustment piece, what we know is that individuals with severe TBI overall tend to have lower global adaptive skills. What does that mean? When we talk about adaptive skills, these are all the things that we need to care for ourselves independently. And this is usually measured long term, so individuals far after they've had any of these injuries overall. The most notable weaknesses tend to come up in their social functioning and their general adjustment. And when we think about some of the impulsivity, limited self-regulation, and some of these other emotional skills, that's not surprising, especially if we couple that with the fact that for many individuals, mood issues and mood symptoms such as depression and anxiety are very common because they're coping with an immensely traumatic event in their life that has very long-standing circumstances that affect them long-term. So if we think about all of the features that come together, it's not surprising. Now, oftentimes we think of social perspective taking. Essentially, we think of theory of mind, the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. That's another area that tends to lag behind in development, and it's tied to some of these higher order cognitive skills. If we think about kids' ability to not just see themselves and others, but know what to do in that situation. So if they see someone crying, do they walk up and ask what's wrong? Do they attempt to offer comfort? Do they know what to do? Or do they avoid someone because they're not sure? All of those different behaviors are going to have a different outcome, and whether that person is viewed as someone who is empathetic and compassionate. And it could just be that someone isn't sure what exactly to do in that moment. Now, we always think about the fact that a lot of times when we get older, we face far more nuanced situations. So it may be that we have a very surface level understanding. If I do something wrong, I say that I'm sorry. But when things get more complex and we have to go beyond just saying sorry, we have to show that we want to make amends. We have to describe why what we did was wrong. That can be a little bit more difficult for many individuals, sort of going beyond just bare minimum to try to make things better or to try to establish and maintain a lot of these social networks and social connections with other individuals. And this is especially true for people in interpersonal relationships, particularly romantic ones, because we all know that there are a lot of nuances we have to know about our partner that help us to make us a good fit for someone. Now, when we move on to the mood piece, again, we know that mood is another big piece of executive functioning more generally, and it's highly tied to our ability to appropriately regulate and express our emotions. So I talked earlier before about this idea of the knee-jerk emotional responses, being able to stop ourselves. So I like to use the example of if you're in traffic and someone cuts you off, you'll probably try to stay calm, not start yelling or get upset, or miss your exit because you're so worked up about that person cutting you off. Well, if you struggle to inhibit those behaviors, struggle to stop yourself in that moment, you might start yelling and get upset and might try to follow that person or do something that could put you at risk or could interfere with your functioning more generally. Again, being able to stop ourselves, know when our behavior is appropriate and inappropriate, and know how to tolerate frustration. These are all immensely important skills because we encounter aspects or environments that elicit frustration in everyday life. For a student, it's being able to sit in a class that they may not like, that may not inherently interest them, but they know that they have to do well because their job is to be a student and they have to learn this material, even if it's not something that's immediately enticing to them. Now, when we move forward into some of these other more practical skills, I always like to think of the idea of driving. Now, a lot of times I'm working with children and adolescents, and for some parents, thinking longer term can be a little scary, but I'll say, something like driving is immensely adaptive, and we know that it relies on so many of these core cognitive functioning skills. It's immensely complicated, and we have to, without conscious thought, regulate a lot of different processes. So think about it. We have to scan our environment, constantly look, make sure we're watching the cars in front of us, beside us, behind us. We have to react at an appropriate time. So if somebody happens to cut us off, we're able to be able to know what to do in that moment. We have to know where someone is spatially, and we have to be able to coordinate both our hands and our eyes so that if we see someone coming into our lane, let's say, we can move the wheel, we can step on the brake as appropriate. And what we know is that for a lot of individuals who struggle here, even individuals who have something like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, you're at a greater likelihood for having something like traffic accidents, or having increased citations. And this is something that for a lot of kids represents a sense of independence, being able to get around your environment by yourself without having to rely on someone else. And I have to tell you that personally, one of the things that can be very, very difficult is talking to someone about whether or not this is realistic for them. So I always like to talk about driving because we tend to sort of forget about it and think of it only with adults, but it's certainly something that we have to consider because kids are going to ask about it, especially teenagers. Now, with respect to academics, what we know is that aspects of executive functioning, especially working memory, so I talked about that phonological processing loop and the visual spatial sketchpad, they start to become inherently important for achievement in as early as first grade. First grade. Because if you think about it, for any of these skills, we have to remain attentive. We have to ignore anything in our environment that could potentially distract us. We may have to do mental operations. So for example, I use the idea of mental math to achieve a certain outcome. And so any weakness in any number of these skills is going to put us behind the 8 ball again and make it harder for us to demonstrate what we've learned, despite being academically motivated and even despite being academically capable. So what we tend to see is that individuals who are very proficient in these areas, these are kids who can keep track of what's coming up, keep track of assignment deadlines, know how to allot time appropriately for any of these longer-term assignments. They can check over their work. Again, all of these sort of sideline skills that are related to academic functioning more generally. So even reading comprehension, we know if you think about the example of someone just reading a chapter from a book, if you're sitting down trying to get through something, you have to, again, pay attention to the material and filter out any other distractions. You have to say to yourself, well, what happened in the previous chapters? As you're reading, you might start to make judgments or predictions about what might happen next. All of these skills are tied to our executive functioning. So being able to remember what happened before and make associations, how does this new chapter relate to what I read before, especially in a more dense volume, something that builds chapter to chapter, something like Harry Potter or Percy Jackson, any of these popular young adult novels, they all require a lot of these skills. Similarly, we see something like written expression as one of the most highly executively demanding skills that we have, because we have to think of a certain topic we want to write about, keep all of our thoughts in mind as we're writing. We have to pay attention to what we call our orthography. So do we look at a word and know that we spelled it correctly? Does the word look right? And we have to construct the sentences mentally and then translate them to kind of the page as we go. And so in addition to just having to pay attention to something, all of these skills that for some people come very naturally can be very, very difficult. We also know that this is what enables an individual to just plan, translate, revise anything, even recalling vocabulary and just paying attention to something is all highly tied here. In mathematics, very similar. We talked about the visual spatial sketchpad and how it relates to mental math, but also multi-step instructions, which is probably the most common issue that a lot of parents will come to me with. Or they'll say, oh, my child is always the one, they'll do the problem correctly, but they added when they should have subtracted. That's attention. Being able to, again, go through and make sure we're performing the correct operation. So we know that there's a lot of other skills that's related to executive functioning that are tied to things like number and estimation, understanding spatial representation. So a lot of new curriculum use things like number lines. Being able to access that, all tied to executive skills. And finally, note-taking. I always like that example because, especially for my middle school and high school students, this is immensely important. Being able to move from listening to the teacher to taking our own notes, not just copying verbatim, but paraphrasing, putting it in our own words so that we know that we understand it. This is something that is uniquely tied to executive skills because, again, it refers back to our ability to alternate, to move from one to another and back without missing out on things. And for a lot of my older students, it's something that really is very, very difficult. Now, I also always like to talk about what exactly a neuropsychologist is, because most times when I have parents or families come in, say, I start out with the question of, do you know who I am, what I do, and what today will consist of? And more often than not, the answer is nope. So essentially what neuropsychologists do is we want to understand brain-behavior relationships. We look at all areas of cognitive functioning, which can include things like general IQ, language skills, so how well do we express ourselves, how well do we understand what's said to us. We look at visual, spatial, and fine motor functions, things like handwriting and dexterity. We look at attention and executive control, things that we focused on a lot today. We look at learning and memory more generally, as well as academic abilities, depending on the individual concern. And we look at their social emotional functioning and try to put all of these factors together and say, what does this individual need to be most successful moving forward in their life? And for many individuals who work in pediatrics, we try to collaborate with schools and many other professionals, whether OTs, speech therapists, psychologists, anyone who's involved in their child's care, as well as families, to help them to understand where their child is right now and what do they need to be their most successful self in the future. Now, when we come down to recommendations, the way that I typically like to think of things is many of these children, we're just trying to teach them compensatory strategies. There's no one silver bullet that can help to improve executive functioning. What we try to do is help the individual understand where their weaknesses are and say, okay, if you tend to be forgetful, do you use certain strategies to keep yourself all on task? Do you help, write to-do lists? Do you use reminders on your phone? Do you set alarms? Things like that. The weaknesses will be there, but we use the strengths an individual has to manage the weaknesses. Now, I always like to use the phrase consistently inconsistent because that's the best way to describe a lot of the children that come in whose parents are talking to me about these abilities. It's also saying that it's not something that's conscious. And again, I try to always draw the connection between there are instances where these behaviors can be misinterpreted and misconstrued, essentially because it's very easy for parents or teachers or peers or anyone else to think someone's doing that on purpose because yesterday they were able to do it just fine and today they can't. And a lot of times for many of these kids, simply because there's something that's getting in their way. Sometimes, yes, they can access the information very easily and it's not an issue. And other days, as some parents will say to me, it's almost like they're on another planet. And it's never because this child doesn't want to be a part of something or they don't want to be successful. It's because sometimes they don't know what tools they should be using to be the most successful self. So what we try to say is, what are the routines that we should establish at home and in school to help to manage any of these weaknesses? Now, one of the things that I always emphasize to families is that in order for this to be most successful, you have to be consistent. Routine is routine is routine. It doesn't change as we move forward. You try to keep things as predictable, clear, and structured as possible. So daily routines for the morning and for bed. We all know that as professionals, these are things that we do implicitly. Someone might have taught it to us more explicitly, or we just started doing it because we saw that model for us. Laying your clothes out the night before, putting your briefcase and lunchbox by the front door so you grab them as you go, keeping everything in certain places, hanging your keys up. All of these things that we may not think of as important skills because we just do them without thought, but that for someone who doesn't always access that consistently is very, very important. And essentially, we just teach them more explicitly. Sometimes that's through motivation, so earning a prize for being consistent in, packing our backpack every night, doing a backpack checklist, or it's simply the reinforcer of being more successful as we get older. Helping children to break down these larger goals. So if you have a book report that's coming up, well, first thing, let's choose a book. Second thing, let's figure out what to write about. Third thing, let's start taking some notes. Using a day planner or an electronic planner. There are a lot of really great app resources. Everybody has a phone at this point or an iPad. Using something like that can be immensely helpful. And having some task prioritization. This is another big one, especially for our older kids. Sometimes it's not about not getting started. It's about getting started on the most important thing right away. For homework, one of the best things is always to have a consistent study routine, study in the same place, someplace you're less likely to be distracted. You have a cell phone, maybe put it on Do Not Disturb, or put it, on the other side of the table where you can access it if you need it, but it's not going to immediately distract you. Working for a certain amount of time. Usually I like the rule of thumb of 25 minutes, taking a 5-minute break, and then going back to work. This way you're able to sustain your attention, you don't get very fatigued, but also you're focusing on being as efficient as you can and reducing any access to some of the short-term distractions. So again, phone or electronics, any of those 5-minute breaks should be used for stretching, not for checking Facebook, because it's a time suck. It's something that draws us in and is very reinforcing. Socially and personally, one of the best things that we can do is facilitate emotional labeling. Again, modeling is important. So perhaps saying to a child, sometimes when I get frustrated, what I do is X, Y, or Z. Working with a therapist can be immensely helpful here, especially if the circumstances of the injury were in and of themselves traumatic. But a lot of times parents can help with that by even watching television shows or movies and saying, what do you think is going to happen next? Or what do you think the character on the screen is feeling right now? Especially for younger kids, where having that conversation can help us to pick up on, well, it looks like he's frowning, so I don't think he's very happy right now. Or his friend just walked away from him, and I think it's starting to upset him. And again, just having a routine for things like when the usual routine changes, when instead of going straight home after school, we might have to stop at the grocery store. Something, a transition that could cause any anxiety, knowing what to do in those instances so that unanticipated changes don't result in significant upset. So I hope that this discussion has been helpful, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have about this material. I welcome any questions from the audience at this time to help clarify any of these points.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murphy. That was amazing. So the first question, are these executive functioning issues something that can be treated with medication?
That's a great question. You know, one of the things that I will typically say is that while the attention piece is something that we know for many individuals, and again, I'm not an MD, I do not prescribe, but it's a question that often comes up. For attention issues and impulsivity, what we tend to see is that medication can be very effective in helping individuals control those behaviors. For the executive skills, we see that skill building and modeling and teaching of these abilities, that tends to be a lot more effective because there's no one kind of cure just for the executive skills in and of themselves. So in some ways, they can just help an individual access any other behavior training or behavioral intervention.
Wonderful. What is the best way to explain my child's functioning to other family members, for example, siblings, cousins?
This is another question that comes up very, very frequently for a lot of our families. And a lot of times I will say that it can depend on the age of the child and the nature of the injury. If the child is able to express themselves, a lot of times I like to include them in the discussion and say, what do you feel comfortable telling other people, especially in the shorter term stages, like after a child initially returns back to school after an injury. If the child is unable to articulate their ideas or thoughts for any reason, a lot of times I'll say to family members that you can describe that this is something that the child is still recovering from, that they're working to develop a lot of these skills, and if there's anything that can be disruptive, working with a therapist to identify how you want to talk about it and what kind of language you want to use, I think can be very, very helpful because, again, a lot of the behaviors that are associated with some of these injuries can be misconstrued very frequently. And a lot of times parents will say to me, you know, I'm trying to use behavioral strategies we've talked about, but when I'm out in the supermarket and, you know, my child is very upset and crying and people are looking at me, I'm not sure what to do. And in some instances, we talk about how the parents can tolerate the stress, or we will just say, you know, this is how we want to explain it from the child's perspective and bring them in for a family session so that especially siblings can understand. Because what we can typically see is there can be a lot of frustration and upset if, say, a younger sibling will, in some instances, surpass their older siblings in certain skills. And so we just describe it in a developmentally appropriate way and encourage that it is an ongoing dialogue. That as the child changes, as their skills change, we are going to continue talking about it and just open up the communication, because keeping it secret can make it a lot more difficult for groups to access over time.
Do you have any suggestions for helping initiation in homework, chores, something that would not get the child angry?
Yes, so typically what we will talk about is one of two things. We try to identify what exactly, if anger is typically the response, what is it about that request that makes the child angry? So sometimes kids will say to me, it's the way that my parent says it. And a lot of times, again, it's done with the child in the room. Because the key is to say, okay, you can feel empowered to tell me what is making you upset, but then we have to find a way to make sure that this is done. So for some kids, they prefer something like a checklist that's displayed on something like a big whiteboard in a prominent area of the house. The child comes in, the checklist is always the same. Do my homework, put my laundry away, put my backpack by the door. The child does it and checks it off so the parent doesn't have to see it in the moment. We can also use things like little alarms, either put on the phone or on something like a time to track or another device to remind the child. If it's that the child says, I forget when I get in, I go right to my video games. Well, maybe the video games are not accessible until all of these things are done. And it puts it on the child to get these things done in order to get a reward. And it can vary depending on the child themselves. Usually we try to make it enticing and motivating in a way that is feasible, workable for the family, and will reduce any kind of tension in the household. Usually I like the idea of timers or just accessing something that they know they want, but simply earning something. You walk in and say, I've done X, Y, or Z, that's when you can get it. If you haven't finished all your chores, okay, the Xbox will be here when you're all done.
Wonderful. So if anyone else has any other questions, please type them in now. And what I'd like to say is that this webinar will be available on our website within the week at vianj.org/webinars, and you'll be able to view the webinar on there under archives. And also, if you'd like a certificate of completion, please email me. My email address is ljacobs, that's ljacobs @vianj.org. And I would say, I think we've covered everything. So at this time, I'd like to thank Dr. Hillary Murphy for volunteering her time to present on this very important topic. This presentation, like I said, will be available within the week, and this has brought us to the end of the webinar. So thank you for attending, and have a wonderful day. And thank you, Doctor.
Thank you so much.